Hi everyone, and welcome to this NAMC presentation. My name is Marie, and today I'll be talking about new insight on structure, properties, and processing of metallic materials informed by multimodal data merging. And before starting, I'd like to thank my collaborators at UCSB in the Materials and Mechanical Engineering departments, as well as from the Institut Clément Ader in France. Today, we'll focus on alloys for structural applications, and in particular nickel-based superalloys, which are used in jet engines. And while single-crystal nickel-based superalloys are quite famous and used for the blades, there are also polycrystalline alloys in these engines, which are used for the discs on which the blades are mounted. During service, these parts are subjected to rather harsh thermomechanical solicitations, namely fatigue and creep fatigue, at temperatures in the range of 650 degrees C. And with time, takeoff, cruise, and landing cycles, fatigue cracks will form in these parts as a result of stress concentrations. And since now these materials are now relatively clean of manufacturing defects, such as pores or large inclusions, the fatigue cracks, have been found to form on crystallographic facets. So in other words, the crack's location is directly linked to the microstructure of the material, which is the different grains and their orientation, shape, and neighborhood at the micron scale in the material. When analyzing the location of fatal cracks in fatigued specimens, it was found that both bulk and surface initiation sites are often associated with specific boundaries between crystals, which are called twin boundaries. And yet, not all twin boundaries are crack initiation sites, and there is still a lack of understanding on where and why cracks would nucleate in particular areas of the microstructure. The observation in cracks in these particular microstructure regions suggests that there were regions where stresses were previously concentrated. So to understand where damage is going to occur, we need to investigate how stresses will concentrate in our material at the small scale. And it usually all starts with irreversible plastic deformation. In these structural materials, dislocation motion is the primary form of plasticity, and in particular, dislocation slip. Here's a schematic of how dislocations will slip in a given crystal. I am showing a dislocation line moving on its slip plane, which is usually a crystallographic plane. Here we're interested in FCC materials, and dislocations at this temperature will slip most likely on 111 planes. And so when a dislocation travels in the lattice, it will eventually produce a unit step of fixed magnitude within this lattice. And transmission electron microscopy obviously is the best microscopy method to image these dislocations. And when you do so, you'll find out that dislocations often glide together on the very same plane. And these kind of defects are called slip bends and are shown on this micrograph. When all these dislocations on the same plane emerge onto the surface, they will create substantial steps, as shown on this cross-section image. And when you observe these kind of defects in the scanning electron microscope, this time, so the SEM from above, these slip bends appear as straight lines, but in reality, you have to think of these as 3D displacements. I'm showing a schematic of what a slip bend really looks like in 3 dimensions. At the location of the slip bend, even though the material is not cracked, you'll still have now a step on the surface, which is characterized by its height and its inclination, which is related to the plane on which dislocations were moving. So in this context, the question we are asking is, can we understand where slip bend will form in the microstructure? Can we predict where they will appear? and hence where the fatigue cracks will eventually form. So we're asking really the question of what are the weak points in this microstructure. So now that we have some background, here's the outline for the rest of my talk. I'll be talking about data collection and what kind of data we collect to actually study these kind of mechanisms. And this will involve both experimental procedure and numerical procedures. And then I will detail the case study of strain localization during monotonic loading in a very famous nickel-based superalloy, which is called Inconel 718. And so let's start right away with details about data collection. So I've been talking about stress concentrations, surface observations, strain localization, so you have probably gotten the hint that we would be using digital image correlation to map the strain field in our materials. Digital image correlation, or DIC, is a pretty common method for this purpose. It involves the tracking of a speckle or pattern onto the surface of the specimen and image correlation algorithms to obtain the strain field on the surface of interest. It was initially implemented at the macroscopic scale, but it has then been adapted for use in the scanning electron microscope. And so what we do practically is that we can conduct in-situ tensile experiments directly in the SEM and take DIC measurements alongside. As far as for the speckle, specific methods have been developed for depositing ultrafine speckles onto the specimen surface. They involve the deposition of nanoparticles by chemical means and surface activation, or sputtering, then etching of thin layers of specific metals onto the sample surface. And since we are dealing with slip bands that produce a discontinuity in the displacement field on the sample surface, DIC codes have to be adapted to take this into account. The recent implementation of Heaviside functions into DIC routines, now called discontinuity tolerant DIC, has enabled to measure slip bands characteristics. These methods and these characteristics involve the intensity of the extrusion on the sample surface, the active slip plane and direction of the dislocations, so the actual plane and direction in which the dislocations within the slip band were moving. And this is accessible if DIC data is coupled to the local crystallographic orientation, so that we can correlate the inclination of this plane to an actual crystallographic plane. And once all these are known, we can even back up the number of dislocations that emerged onto the sample surface. All these quantities are measured in each point of our DIC maps, which can actually be pretty big. A finalized DIC map looks like shown on this slide. We are looking at the strain field in the loading direction, which is horizontal, mapped by DIC with the sample's microstructure alongside captured by EBSD. And you can see that we can map fairly large representative areas thanks to recent advancements in electron microscopy, and yet the resolution of DIC for the step, the extrusion created by the slip bands, is about 10 nanometers. So in the end, that technique really offers a good combination between excellent resolution and large fields of view. Okay, so we got this DIC data on one hand, and we now need to collect our 3D microstructure data. To do so, we use the tri-beam system, which has been developed over the past decade in TRISA Pollux group. The tri-beam consists of femtosecond laser optics mounted on a dual-beam microscope. The microscope is shown on this image, and basically it has an electron beam for imaging, as well as a bunch of other detectors, plus the laser and ion beam. The laser is used to slice the material in a serial sectioning manner, and we picked femtosecond lasers that have a high ablation rate, yet create very little damage in the material. If required, after we use the laser, the ion beam can be used to clean up the ablated surface before data is acquired. There is a possibility of acquiring image data, chemical data, and crystallographic data with this system. And basically, in practice, we collect data over consecutive slices, evenly sliced, repeating these cycles to reconstruct our 3D microstructure. So we'll go through hundreds of times this kind of cycle where you have data collection, then you slice your material with the laser, possibly use the fib cleanup, and then collect your data, and so on. So once this data is acquired, we can assemble the different slices and post-process the data. To do so, we use the Dream 3D software, which enables to stack our data sets and extract most of the useful information we are interested in by creating this kind of custom pipelines. And so far, a variety of data sets have been collected and reconstructed in the Polar group. They involve mostly metallic materials, but also composites or functional materials. Again, you can see that we can gather data on very large volumes, typically 1 cubic millimeter, in reasonable time, which is 5 to 8 days. And so that millimetric size is really what we are after in these datasets, because it really is the size of our region of interest for the strain localization phenomena we are investigating. But yet, when we think about it, 1 cubic millimeter worth of data is quite a lot, and when it's divided into two different datasets, so DIC and 3D BSD, then it's not really convenient to look at so much data manually. So in the next section, I will present tools that I have developed in order to merge these large datasets of different nature, look at it, and extract statistics out of it in an automated, fast, and convenient manner. In fact, there is no software to recombine DIC data with 3D BSD, so I have been developing a series of routines that enable to align and merge these large datasets all together. The first issue that we have to overcome is that of data alignment. So you have to know that the area or volume over which we collect the data is not always exactly the same, and that the grid on which we collect the data is also different. On top of it, the different datasets are distorted relatively to each other as a consequence of the detector artifacts, and there isn't much we can do about these artifacts. So in the past years, I have been developing numerical techniques that automatically correct the relative distortions in the datasets, resample the data onto a unique grid, and crop it to our area of interest where we actually have all the data. In collaboration with a French laboratory called INRIA, we have been using machine learning and multivariable optimization routines to align complex data automatically. We define a similarity parameter between the two datasets we want to merge and use an algorithm that will try out a variety of distortion compensation functions. And we choose polynomial functions for their versatility. And all this is done in a non-supervised manner. So in other words, the algorithm will find what coefficient of our distortion function yield to the highest similarity between the images that we want to align. The code usually runs pretty fast on a laptop and finds the distortion function within 10 to 15 minutes. In a typical dataset, we recombine DIC data with 2D BSD and or 3D BSD. And today I will focus on merging DIC with 3D BSD only. Once the data is all aligned, we need to segment the object of interest and by this I mean the microstructural objects. And while Dream3D takes care of most microstructure objects, I have been implementing additional routines that enable to segment grain boundaries, individual triple junctions, which are junctions between 3 different crystals, and quadruple points. On this slide, I am showing an example of such objects in a tiny dataset, where grain boundaries are shown in blue. There are 2D objects. Triple junctions are lines, and quadruple points are points. Here's another view of what triple junctions look like in 3 dimensions, and this time on a real-life, real-size dataset. And you can see the very intricate network of triple junction in a typical material. So keep in mind that this skeleton and this structure of triple junctions, what it looks like, because we will really be needing that in the rest of the talk. And finally, we need to segment the individual slip bands, as raw DIC data is just basically images with different pixel values. So the human eye might see that this is an actual slip band, but for the software or imaging software that we use, these are just pixels values. And so in our case, one advantage of the discontinuity tolerant DIC code that we use is that the maps we obtain are relatively easy to segment. And in practice, we use a series of Hopf transformations, which are very simple transformations that are commonly used to detect line features in images. So we use this transformation to segment individual slip bands and eventually assign a single number ID to each slip band within our datasets. Once this is done, we can then extract the inclination and location of every single slip band. And since our data, DIC data, is all aligned with the BSD, we also know the local crystallographic orientation associated to every slip band. And so we can now back up what is the slip plane associated to each slip band. And so, quick recap here, this is the plane on which these locations were gliding. So in these kind of materials, we know that 1-1-1 planes are the slip planes candidates. We generate what traces those planes would have on our sample surface. We compare all those 4 traces with the experimentally measured trace through this theta angle, and then assign a plane if there is a match among the 4 candidates. And this procedure is pretty fast and quite efficient, since we're able to find over 90% of the slip planes. Now that we know the slip plane coordinates, we actually know the plane normal to the slip band in the reference frame of the crystal. So we know its HKL indices. And we can then project the exact location and 3D orientation of every single slip band in our dataset. All we need for that is to rotate the slip band normal, so this HKL vector indices, to our sample reference frame using a simple dot product involving a rotation matrix. That rotation matrix brings our crystal frame to our macroscopic sample frame, and then we obtain our slip band normal in 3D. I'm showing an example here where we had a visible slip trace on the sample surface in that blue grain, and using this procedure, we could reconstruct the 3D nature of the slip band, so we could assign exactly what 1-1-1 plane was active for the slip band in that particular crystal, and we know the exact coordinates of the slip band, so we can actually plot it in 3D using eBSD and 2D DIC collected on the surface. So I'm guessing that's enough, heavy enough for techniques, and let's talk about material science now. So in the remaining of the talk, I want to show you how we can learn insightful information about strain localization behavior using the previously described multimodal data merging technique. The material I will focus on is Inconel 718, which is a very common nickel-based superalloy, and the microstructure of our particular sample exhibits no texture. There was no preferential orientation of the different crystals within the material. It had equiaxed grains and a homogeneous grain size of 60 microns on average. And here we will investigate the material's behavior at the yield point, which corresponds to the black dot shown on this stress strain curve. You can see that this material has a relatively high strength at room temperature. And the goal of this test is to understand if the location of slip bands is related to the macrostructure, and if yes, how. And before starting, one should keep in mind that the longest and most intense slip bands are the ones that produce the highest extrusion on the sample surface. These ones are the most critical ones in terms of fatigue crack nucleation. So during fatigue, slip bands will form during the very first cycle, so we really need to understand where and why they form, and we can do that with a simple monotonic test. So we collected our DIC data and 3D BC data over a relatively large volume and using a quite fine voxel size of 1 micron. Our final dataset contains over 1,000 grains, several hundreds of slip bands, and thousands of triple junctions. On this composite image, I'm showing the location of the slip band in the 3D microstructure with this view of the merged dataset. And you can see that the slip bands on the surface, where we have collected data, are projected into the first layer of grains. And one very important thing here is that we only collect the AC data on the free surface, so we can resolve actually all the slip bands in the first layer of grains. However, there are actually more slip bands in the bulk of the dataset, which we obviously cannot capture, but you will see that we can learn a lot already about slip band nucleation and behavior and how they are connected with the 3D microstructure with this kind of datasets. When looking at individual slip bands in relation to the 3D microstructure, several particular locations are frequently observed. The first one is when you have a slip band that develops parallel and close to an annealing twin boundary. We call this a parallel slip configuration. Annealing twin boundaries are special boundaries that are present in these materials, and we cannot really avoid them. There are straight and flat boundaries. There are also on one-moment planes. Two of them are present in that grain on the left, and in that case you see that the slip bands shown in dark gray are parallel and very close, but not on the actual twin boundary, just very close. So that's the first configuration. The second configuration we see quite often is shown in the middle. It involves a slip band emanating from a triple junction. In that particular case, the junction between grains 1, 2, and 3 is shown with a red marker, and the slip band connects directly to it. That is a very frequent configuration, and we could absolutely not have seen it if we didn't have the 3D data, since actually the slip band connects to the triple junction below the surface, so there's no way we could have guessed that if we had only the 2D data. And finally, the last configuration that we see quite often is that of slip transmission. And transmission is a process by which dislocation glides from a crystal to another, and this is usually a good thing to happen as it distributes the stresses within the material. In this example, there are 3 slip bands that are transmitted from one orientation to another, and this occurs in all 3 grains 1, 2, and 3. Being able to visually identify these configurations based on a few observations is already one big achievement by itself. Yet one cannot systematically, manually look at over several, like hundreds of individual slip bands one by one. So we really need to automate this kind of procedure if we want to have a statistical perspective of how frequent we observe these configurations. To give a quantitative insight on how frequent these configurations are observed, I have been writing some code that automatically detects the geometric configuration of each slip band according to the three categories we identified previously. After running the code for all the slip bands in the dataset, the statistics we obtain are somewhat unexpected. As you can see on the pie plot, a majority of slip bands are either in parallel slip configuration or in contact with triple junction. So parallel slip are shown in pink, and triple junctions, bands connected to triple junctions, are shown in teal. And of course, a slip band can be in several configurations at the same time. For example, you can totally imagine that a slip band can be connected to a triple junction while also being parallel to a twin boundary. In the end, when you've considered all possible combination of the three specific configurations we had observed manually, only a very few slip bands remain that are in none of these configurations. And this is the gray sector on the plot. We can calculate the average intensity of each slip band, and so how high of a step it creates on the surface, and plot this distribution according to the type of slip band, according to all these categories. And we clearly see that the most intense slip bands are these in parallel slip configurations or these connected to triple junctions. Those in transmission and other bands are of relatively low intensity, so this means that they are less likely to initiate a fatigue crack and they are of lesser interest for our study. We can make a similar observation about the length of the slip bands, and in other words, when we consider the most critical slip bands, which are the longest and most intense ones, we see that they are all connected to the macrostructure. And this observation was only possible because we have 3D data. And once we know this, the question we may want to ask is, what are the physics behind that? Why do slip bands form in these particular locations? In other words, what are the micromechanics behind the creation of a slip band in a particular spot in the macrostructure? As I said previously, the slip bands in parallel slip configurations are in the vicinity of twin boundaries. And these boundaries separate two crystal orientations which have a specific orientation relationship. And therefore, they likely possess different elastic moduli. A high difference in elastic modulus across a boundary is actually likely to trigger stress concentrations. When investigating this kind of thing, we can think of another common parameter that we usually use for studying plasticity, which is the Schmidt factor. And on this slide, I am showing how these two parameters affect the slip bands that are in a parallel slip configuration. So I'm showing two different plots where each marker corresponds to an individual slip band in parallel slip. The marker size is proportional to the slip band length, and the marker color is proportional to the slip band intensity. On the plot on the left, the x-axis is the Schmidt factor, which gives us an indication about the shear stress on the slip plane of the slip band. The y-axis is the difference in elastic modulus across the twin boundary. We see that most slip bands developed near twin boundaries that had either high Schmidt factor or a high difference in elastic modulus. So high Schmidt factor are these hotspots, and high elastic modulus, these kind of bands. And on the second plot, we learn from this 3D characterization that the larger the twin boundary area, the more intense the slip band. So the critical slip bands are the ones with high Schmidt factor along the 1-1-1 plane, the critical twin boundary, or that have a high difference in elastic modulus and have a large twin plane area. The stress concentrations near twin boundary actually doesn't really need 3D data to be explained and understood. Crystal plasticity calculations actually confirm the trends observed experimentally already in 2D, and therefore we can say that this crystallographic criterion is, in first approach, good enough to determine whether a twin boundary is favorably oriented for parallel slip or not. And if we come back to our pie chart, we can actually understand the origin of a large part of the slip bands based on this simple crystallographic criterion. Now, can we also understand why slip bands form around triple junctions? So when we look at what happens around triple junctions in our dataset, we see that plasticity produced either a slip band, like shown on the left, or intense lattice rotations, like shown on the right. And now, contrary to grain boundaries, which are objects that involve only 2 grains and are relatively simple to describe, triple junctions are inherently way more complex. They connect 3 different grains, they possess many degrees of freedom, and it would be quite tedious to try and identify what parameters would indicate whether a triple junction is likely to initiate a slip band or lattice rotations with just analytical tools. But in the end, it is the behavior of individual dislocations, which is related to local stresses, that determines whether a slip band will form or not. Following this idea, we formulate the hypothesis that a slip band forms when one main system is active, which implies that all the dislocations glide onto the same crystallographic plane, and that lattice rotations are observed when several slip systems are simultaneously active. To check this hypothesis, we have been performing crystal plasticity calculations that tell us what slip systems are active during loading, and since we have the 3D microstructure information all captured, we simply tessellate and mesh the volume of our experimental dataset. We take profit of the statistical analysis presented earlier to identify some triple junctions of interest that either trigger a slip band, either trigger intense lattice rotations, and we run calculations on this smaller dataset. Here's an example of what this looks like. We have a triple junction between the 3 grains and the crop datasets around it. One way to validate our model and approach is to compare the spatial distribution of crystal rotations between the experiment and calculation. Here I am plotting for this particular triple junction the rotations obtained experimentally on the left, and with the calculation on the right. You can see that not only the location, but also the magnitude of the lattice rotations are comparable. This is particularly remarkable given the size of our datasets, and we believe that such good agreement is only possible when calculations are done on a real 3D dataset with all the grain orientation, structure, morphology, and neighborhoods. So since our model is validated, we can go back to our triple junctions of interest. And the first example I want to show you is one triple junction around which we had observed intense lattice rotations. It is made of 3 grains showed here, and we isolate the 1 grains that had the highest lattice rotations. We sample a small region of interest around this particular triple junction, and when we look at the cumulated slip activity through the step, so the output of our CPFE calculation, we see that several slip systems were active during loading. The different slopes on the individual curves reveals that the activity of the systems evolved during loading. And to explain that, one can easily imagine that local crystallographic rotations triggered different slip systems during loading by changing their resolved shear stresses along the way. So that is the first type of triple junctions. And now comes the second type. We have experimentally observed around the different triple junction a slip band directly emerging from the triple junction, and we could actually precisely identify the active slip system within that slip band, which is this one plane and that one direction. That system is called also A2. And we go through the very same procedure and look at the plasticity within a small region of our grain where the slip band was observed. This time, only one system is dominant through loading. Some secondary systems eventually become activated, but what we see is that most of the stress is accommodated on one single system, which is A2 from the CPFE calculation, and that corresponds exactly to the experimental observation. We believe that such a good agreement is directly linked to the fact that we took into account the 3D nature of the microstructure, its crystallography, and its geometry. Therefore, using geometric and crystallographic considerations, we can understand why some triple junction will induce the formation of slip bands while others won't. So to summarize, we have shown that developing tools to accurately map slip bands capture the three-dimensionality of the microstructure, merge this information all together so that we can look at this kind of data in a statistical, fast, and automated manner that is also non-human biased is really the key to understand strain localization in structural materials. Our investigation have led to the definition of a geometric and crystallographic criterion for the prediction of the location of intense slip band in relation to the microstructure feature. The very same microstructure feature actually were seen to nucleate fatigue cracks during cyclic loading. And so we have extensively worked on the Inconel 718 dataset, and we are now investigating other alloys of different structure. So this one was FCC, now we're moving on to HCP materials. And for future steps, so there are some more developments that we're doing for designing custom workflows for multimodal data merging and extending these kind of workflows to other types of data. But from what's more interesting is from a material science point of view, now that we know the weak points of the microstructure, we can think of designing new microstructure that exhibit lower strain localization and hopefully better fatigue resistance. And to do so you have to know that these materials are usually forged at high temperature, and the microstructure of these materials directly results from the processing, so the processing conditions in which the material was forged. And by adjusting these processes, you can tune your macrostructure. If you are interested in such phenomena, I invite you to read this article that we have published this year, in which we have successfully reduced strain localization in a newer generation nickel-based superalloy. And to do so, we had been introducing second phase particles on the twin boundary so that we don't have long and large twin boundaries anymore, and those particles, which are shown here in black, actually block dislocation motion. They better resist dislocation motion, and so we observed that strain localization is greatly reduced in a local and overall manner in the engineered microstructure. And what we saw during cyclic loading, so this time fatigue, is that by comparing the material with no precipitates and with precipitates, so the second phase particles, we could see that these particles not only reduce strain localization, but also block fatigue crack propagation. So we're really hoping that this kind of new designs and processing pathways will produce materials that have better fatigue properties. And before finishing, I would like to thank my funding sources, the Department of Energy, as well as the computational facilities at UCSB, so we could actually perform all these intense calculations. And with this, I will wrap up and thank you for your attention.